1812 hours, April 15th, 2539, military calendar. Me-Trome system, planet boundary, downtown sanctuary. The Spartan's Pelican touched down on the singular landing pad of the impromptu firebase. For the past half hour, Arthur and Sheila had been trying, to no avail, to raise General Grant. The best intelligence they could gather was from one pissed-off lieutenant governor and his staff. Apparently, the good general decided to up and leave the command bunker situated at Ground Zero with a handful of troops to go rescue his wife and son. As admirable as it was to brave a Covenant armada for such a noble mission, it was clearly fueled by emotion rather than tactical necessity. Unfortunately for the pair, they were now his best chance for survival, if he was alive at all. Both the lieutenant governor and Governor Huxley agreed that the general was vital to the continued battle raging above and below the skies of Boundary, so they begrudgingly agreed to commit assets toward his recovery. "Any word from Captain Patel?" Arthur said. Although two fully armed Spartans was nothing to scoff at. Even they could not simply fly into the city center looking for a rogue general. The plan was about as straightforward as it went. Stash the Pelican at the newly constructed firebase outside the city and away from the brunt of the fighting. Pick up a platoon of straight-leg Marines, then use a few warthogs to get as close as they could before dismount. If the streets were too congested with fighting, they'd divert course and use the network of subterranean tunnels from Boundary's terraforming days to pop up where the Springfield Municipal Bank resided. "Actually, there he is now," Sheila said. A tanned, middle-aged man with a silver streak in his close-cropped hair strode through the permacrete barricades, helmet clutched to his side. Captain Patel was the company commander of Kilo Company in charge of managing Teal Base, as it was coined. When Arthur and his team landed days prior, they decided to pick a discreet location away from the city in a tactically superior, less conspicuous location. The firebase was dropped off by their D-20 Heron, and hastily constructed with a fleet of naval personnel from the Nephris. In no time at all, walls were constructed, patrols were established, and the hangar was filled with all manner of ground and air vehicles. The Marine slowed to a halt, unable to conceal his slack-jawed expression before a pair of hulking humanoid-shaped killing machines. Undoubtedly, the captain had never seen, let alone interacted with, a Spartan before. To most outsiders, or essentially anyone outside of the Office of Naval Intelligence Section 3, Spartans were myths. What Captain Patel saw before him was the shape of a man with no face, and standing well over 2.5 meters in height, brandishing a small arsenal on his person. The one with the number 079 inscribed on its left chest plate wielded an MA-5B assault rifle, an M6D standard-issue pistol on the right magnetic thigh clamp, several fragmentation grenades strewn across its waist, tactical pads scrolling with data on its left wrist, and a myriad of other pouches and hard cases filled completely with other mission-essential gear. An awkward moment of silence passed before the man cleared his throat and blinked away his dumbstruck look. "Welcome back to the party, Petty Officer." "Thank you, sir," Arthur replied in kind. "Sounds like General Grant is in trouble. We've come back to assist. I spoke with your XO earlier. I assume he relayed the message. By chance, Captain Patel had been on a leader's reconnaissance with a few squads to the north of the city. He missed the radio traffic from both Teal Base and Arthur himself." "I did. Come with me." The pair walked together toward the maintenance bay, the massive half-ton of Mjolnir armor thudding quietly on the earth below. Arthur could see they'd been busy since their departure to the Iran mountain range. It was a bustling scene of activity as his polarized visor adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. They walked through the massive threshold of the hangar to see a large procession of UNSC vehicles preparing for combat. Captain Patel, Arthur, and Sheila stopped to take stock at what they observed. "We're acting as QRF right now," Captain Patel said in a more confident voice. "We lost top cover from the Nephris a while ago, so no orbital support or intelligence. Since that cruiser moved into position over the city center, we've lost aerial reconnaissance assets as well." He wasn't referring to the wings of Hornets, Pelicans, or broadswords patrolling the southern hemisphere, but to a network of spy drones deployed in the lower layers of Boundary's atmosphere, in addition to most, if not all, of Boundary's satellite network. It was a given that air superiority would be out the window as soon as the Covenant made landfall anyways, so local commanders took that into account during their planning sessions. It was a lucky break for Captain Fulton's ground assets that Boundary happened to have a network of sewers, tunnels, and storage facilities below ground. The public servant Mallory Johnson had been instrumental in their planning yesterday, due to her direct involvement in the design and architecture of the city's infrastructure. She knew every route, pipe, and conduit to navigate the network below. She had also been the government-backed point person, leading the strategy for the many platoons of Marines and militia soldiers scattered throughout the city, charged with setting up booby traps, hard points, and other man-made barriers to either slow the aliens' advances, redirect them away from population blocks, or simply trap them in the tunnels below. So for now, orders are to support where we can. Sounds like you're cashing in your ticket already, he said more matter-of-factly than a question. I've got a handful of hogs at the far end of the hangar, port side. He flashed a finger at the back left corner of the building. Head back there and find Sergeant Phoenix, he'll get you some Marines. The captain paused and stiffened. He spun around to face the Titan clad in powered assault armor. Good luck out there, petty officer. Unfortunately, I've got to head back to my shop. Regiment is working on a blocking action toward the southern edge of the city. Understood, sir. Anything else you need, I'll make sure to prioritize. Just let me know. Thank you, sir. If you could point us to the armory, that would be much appreciated. Captain Patel flashed a quick grin and transferred the base's updated schematics to Arthur's TACpad. Here you go. What's ours is yours. Leave us a few toys just in case. The captain chuckled, then took his leave. The de facto leader of Teal Force turned to Sheila. You heard the man, let's get to it. I'll get our escort rounded up. By the time he had even finished his sentence, Sheila was already at a brisk clip away from the hangar, eager to get back in the fight. Arthur made his way down the hangar past several Scorpion main battle tanks, a few AV-14 Hornet platforms, and a handful of Mongoose all-terrain vehicles before he stumbled upon a gaggle of Marines milling about or working on a vehicle chassis. An orderly group given the chaos within the hangar. Arthur saw a gruff sergeant standing vigilant over the group. He was supervising a junior Marine adding another belt of ammunition to one of the warthogs. Sergeant Phoenix had an accent and complexion Arthur recognized from visits to the inner colonies. Olive-skinned with a South American dialect, he had a fire in his voice that screamed former drill instructor. Since Arthur had a moment to spare while the sergeant was dressing down a junior Marine, so he pulled up his service record. As fast as he could think it, his onboard computer displayed the sergeant's service history. It read, Sergeant Phoenix Dominic J. Service number 12489-19832-DF. Graduate Unified Combined Military Boot Camp, Earth, December 12th, 2527. Gratney Wallace Hierarchical Aptitude Score 64. Permanent change of station, 7th February 2527. Assigned to UNSC Marine Corps 21st Marine Division. Something in the record caught his eye. The platoon sergeant before him was with the 21st Marine Division, which meant he was a veteran of several campaigns. And based on his enlistment date, he probably joined up when he heard news of the Covenant glassing harvest and a dozen other Outer Colonies worlds by that point. His experience will come in handy when we head into town, he thought, and blinked away the man's service record. He decided the appropriate amount of time had passed before interrupting the spirited Marine. He walked up the platoon and waited for a moment. The inevitable came an instant later. Arthur knew he didn't need to say anything. He looked down at the Marines and waited for the awe to pass. The majority of the platoon gaped slack-jawed. Some whooped with invigorated spirits, and some scared speechless. Sergeant Phoenix, however, simply stood up and leered at the Spartan. What are you, some fancy ODST and swanky armor or something? The response caught Arthur off guard. Not knowing what to say and needing to get back on mission, he simply complied. Something like that, Sergeant. Call me Arthur, or Sierra 079, whichever you prefer. Please get your men ready in the hogs outside the hangar. Sheila and I will meet you out front in 5. The Spartan took a quick glance across the hangar's corner where the fleet of reconnaissance warthogs and Sergeant Phoenix's Marines stood ready. He gave a quick nod to a young female with a freckled face. She noticed the mirrored faceplate after a second and hardened her expression. The look spoke volumes, that they had glass for breakfast and nails for lunch, that they were ready to stick it to these goddamn alien invaders. Heading back to the mouth of the large hangar, Arthur wondered if Boundary would be any different than the last dozen worlds he'd helped to defend. During almost every engagement on the ground, he and his fellow Spartans had the upper hand. It was the Covenant's sheer number and overwhelming firepower they brought to bear that was the issue. Humanity simply couldn't muster enough resources to reinforce every world, especially the outer colonies, which continued to get hit the hardest. But there was no time to dwell on past failed missions. He needed to focus now on keeping these Marines, his team, and as many civilians alive as possible. He exited the hangar and found Sheila already standing next to the Pelican they arrived in, double-checking all the equipment she could scrounge up from the armory and supplemented her already impressive armory of weaponry stashed in the Pelican. Sheila was finishing a hasty inspection of her MA-5B's bolt carrier group. Satisfied with the state of the rifle, even after hundreds of rounds passed through it from the previous day's fighting, she slung it once again over her head and snapped into place on the magnetic plate behind her fusion pack. Laid out neatly before her was about every weapon he could ask for. 3 assault rifles, 2 shotguns for tight situations underground, 2 crates of fragmentation grenades, a few satchels of extra ammunition and filled magazines, 4 Spanker M41 shoulder-fired rocket launchers, backup tubes, and so much more. Not a bad selection for a firebase out here in the sticks, she said, satisfied. Couldn't find one of those variable 4 power optics you're so partial to, though. Arthur gave a quick 2-fingered swipe across his faceplate, bent over and picked up one of the M19 double-barreled missile tubes. Several years ago in training, the young recruits of the Spartan II program had developed a secret language known only to a select few. The simple gesture of a finger swipe indicating a smile, the closest thing Spartans got to outward emotion. He secured the tube in one of the many satchels before him, adding a few extra magazines and M9 frag grenades to the mix. A quick chuckle to himself. Even after all these years of fighting, most of the time with other Spartans, Sheila still remembered his preferences. That's a shame, he said, continuing to pack up munitions and weapons into every half-empty pouch and bag on his person. Guess I'll have to settle for an extra tube on the jackhammer. He hoisted an M41 onto one shoulder, then turned around to hear a cacophony of sound exploding from the hangar's bay doors behind him. The pair of Spartans stood near the loading ramp of the Pelican and watched as a procession of warthogs came barreling out, each with at least a driver and gunner on the M41 Vulcan chain guns. The fleet of warthogs came to a stop and to the center stage on the flight deck where the 2 were standing on. Sergeant Phoenix and another squad leader, Arthur noted his name as Corporal Hester from his IFF tag, walked up to the pair. Sir, 1 platoon of mean green fighting machines at your disposal. With a sly grin, he slapped the back of the man at his side. Let's get this show on the road. Acknowledged, Sergeant, I'll take the center hog. He turned to Sheila. You're on rabbit duty, he said. She would be on point as the team's security specialist, charged with springing any traps along the way and drawing the short straw to be bait. It was approximately 30 kilometers from where Teal Team had last hid from General Grant, based on the triangulated signal relayed and propagated through a few battalion radio freaks in the area. Arthur took his place in the passenger seat of the 6th Warthog in the convoy and tuned into the platoon's dedicated comm frequency. Marines, this is Sierra 079. We're heading straight in. Tactical column formation across the open terrain until we get to the city limits. After we cross phase line 2, he pulled up the tactical map into his heads-up display and designated each phase line for the soldiers. Move to a wedge formation. It's going to be hot once we get closer to the rescue beacon. If anything happens to your hog or you get separated, stay where you are and call for extraction. He switched over to the private team comm channel and raised Sheila. Grab a mongoose and get a head start. Eyes on the skies, Spartan, he said. Sheila was an outstanding scout and had an odd maternal attitude when it came to protecting soldiers and civilians on mission. She would rather take off alone and endanger herself before letting any non-augmented person take a shot meant for her. A simple green orb flashed in his helmet's visor, acknowledging the command. He looked up toward the front of the column now to see a lone soldier tear out of Teal Base to the vast, open plains in the distance. The Mongoose's engine roared in defiance of her weight. With the additional ammunition, rocket launcher, and her half-ton of Mjolnir-powered assault armor, the Mongoose's wheels struggled for a moment to find purchase in the soft earth before biting in. The convoy took off from the exit of Teal Base as a solid clip. Each Marine knew the mission, briefed by the company executive officer in Captain Patel's stead. Arthur and Sheila had conveniently arrived as the platoon was completing final preparations to their kits and vehicles. In the distance, he could see the dwindling but rising trail of dust from Sheila's Mongoose ATV ripping through the fertile soil beneath. Beyond her and toward the horizon, the sky was ablaze with a sickly deep amber glow. The Covenant hadn't started glassing any sections of the city for reasons unknown to Arthur, but they had razed several large buildings to the ground with targeted plasma strikes since he was last in town fighting. The ride went quickly and quietly. No hostile contacts detected from the convoy or Sheila. Arthur raised his forearm up to view the tactical pad fixed on his left vambrace. He demarked that they had just crossed the second phase line, which marked that they were about 5 kilometers out from the industrial section on the northeast side of the city. The Spartan hailed the squad leaders in the convoy and relayed the information. One by one, the Marines replied in acknowledgement until the comms were interrupted by a burst of static. Riding in the center vehicle had its advantages and disadvantages, and at the moment it was a disadvantage. He rose in a low squat over the roll cage of the Warthog, center stage of the 12-vehicle convoy. Arthur squinted first toward the front of the column and scanned the vicinity for trouble and saw none. He looked past the convoy into the distance to see a flight of banshees dive-bombing a vehicle zigging and zagging over the rises and falls of the grasslands beyond. It swerved left in a collision course with a massive elm tree, only to dodge it at the last moment as it exploded in a flash of fire. He knew instantly that Sheila was in hot water. He tried to raise her on comms but received only a wash of static for his efforts. Sheila swerved to the right and doubled back the way she came, offset at an angle back toward the convoy. A line of plasma bolts stitched the dirt road she was following before striking the back of the Mongoose ATV. He saw a spark, and a plume of black smoke began to wasp into the air behind her. Switching tact, he raised the platoon general frequency. "Gunners, look alive. Flight of Banshees, I count 8 so far," he said while shouldering his jackhammer rock launcher, trying once again to raise Sheila on comms. It only took a moment for the Marines behind their M41 LAGs to release a torrent of anti-aircraft fire upon the hostile aircraft. Hundreds of rounds began to rip through the air toward their intended targets. The lead Warthog scored a direct hit on the nearest Banshee, now only a few hundred meters away, and well within their maximum engagement distance. The turret gunners wrought havoc on the enemy formation. Star-shaped impressions began to dimple the bulbous carapace of another craft. Its glowing gravity pod failed on one side, completely blown away from the canard and crashed in a glorious smoking heap behind a grove of trees. Arthur was the 6th vehicle in the procession, so he waited to disengage the safety on the spanker. Using time to his favor, he raised Sheila on Team Comm once again while his HUD struggled to acquire a target for lock. Teal 3 status. Arthur tried again, this time receiving a much clearer response. Now that the flight was under sustained fire, they nearly stopped shooting at the other Spartan altogether. "Good timing out there," Sheila said with a strained voice. "Lucky fuel rod shot struck the chassis and flipped me. Holding position around the hairpin turn of the river over, the comm died." His teammate had now dropped a waypoint to her location. He could see both muzzle flashing and a ball of fire erupting once just above ground level. Then again as she scored a direct hit on the forward carapace of a greedy Banshee that didn't realize their wingman had already been dispatched. Even with the odds stacked against her, neither her voice nor her actions betrayed any sign of concern. As the convoy commander, Arthur had to think of the situation as a whole. He still had the mission at hand to rescue General Grant, but now he had to secure Sheila as well. He decided to raise First Squad and pulled up the platoon roster. Corporal Hester's name had the designation of this billet and hailed him on Squad Comm. "Corporal Hester, Teal 1. Need you to divert to these coordinates. Sierra 065 is down and needs assistance." "Roger that, sir. We'll set up a perimeter. ETA 30 seconds. Corporal Hester began issuing orders to the other vehicles. Arthur was monitoring the traffic while trying to find Sheila in the fray they were currently driving into. Above his head, the Warthog's gunner continued to rattle deafening bursts of 12.7 by 99mm armor-piercing rounds toward the dwindling flock of Banshees. The convoy maintained their wedge formation, now a loose diamond shape, and accelerated toward Sheila's waypoint. A deadly game of tug-of-war continued to play out in the open terrain before Arthur. Streaks of blue-white superheated plasma traded purchase on the titanium A-plated Warthogs, while caliber rounds and M19 rockets streaked toward the sky. Toward the rear of the procession and beyond Arthur's line of sight, he could both hear the screams of a Warthog exploding, its passengers careening from the vehicle in a brilliant ball of fire. The culprit overhead, an overzealous Banshee pilot, dropped its payload directly onto the hood of the vehicle, sending it flying through the air in a macabre ballet of orange flame and twisted metal. The Banshees screamed past the convoy only a few meters above Arthur's head. As the Marines felled yet another Banshee, they began to position their vehicles in a semicircle around the burning, twisted remains of the Mongoose ATV. It was flipped upside down in a runoff ditch next to a rocky outcropping which arched over a meandering ravine below. Arthur located a sharp bend where the river slowed and identified a large shadow under the outcropping she described. The vehicles came to a halt as the last of the Banshee's flight attempted to fly away in vain. One Marine with an SRS-99 AM sniper rifle hurriedly exited the passenger seat of one Warthog on the tangent of the semicircle and rested the bipod atop its hood and took aim. A few heartbeats later, while Arthur began to jog over to Sheila's position and expecting the worst, he heard two sharp cracks toward the lone Banshee's exit vector. Sprinting to clear the drainage ditch ahead, he glanced to his left to see two fleeting vapor trails, and farther beyond, the sole Covenant aircraft was now careening toward a fiery death. He reached the outcropping in time to see a battered but intact Spartan emerge from a recess of large boulders under the overhang and above the ravine. Arthur came to a halt and gave her a once-over. She would never admit it, but her biosigns were elevated from the close encounter. Data scrolled over the periphery of his vision to show that Spartan 065 had second-degree burns across a section of her forearm, and what seemed like a mild concussion. That rollover must have hit her harder than she let on. If Arthur were a betting man, he'd put money on the comm static, and lack of response from Sheila was due to the trauma inflicted on her helmet from the crash. He noticed a fresh crease in the helmet and a dent around the curve of her visor. Hit a snag, did we? She scrambled up the shallow bank, slipped under a patch of mud, and started negotiating the rocky outcrop. After confirming she was alive and functional, he walked up to the embankment and reached down. Sheila walked over to him, wearing the scars of the strafing Banshee fire on her body armor. He noticed her flexing a hand and rubbing her left vambrace. Further examination of her appearance revealed a matte black scorch mark near the crook of her elbow where she took a plasma round. The Mark IV Mjolnir variant, along with each Spartan's skunkwork experimental kit for optimized performance, provided near-impervious protection to conventional human small arms fire. But when it came to 4,000-degree magnetically shaped plasma weaponry, it didn't hold up so well. The reinforced titanium alloy shell and, to a lesser extent, the titanium nanocomposite bodysuit could take only a few glancing shots or perhaps one or two direct shots without being breached or failing completely. Minus her forearm and concussion, she seemed no worse for the wear. Sheared portions of stealth coating had revealed the undercoat of titanium alloy in some locations, as well as several carbon-scored starbursts across her breastplate and thighs. All cosmetic, he thought, and dismissed the bio readout. Sheila reached up with her unscathed right hand and allowed the team leader to pull her out of the muddy bank. She scrambled up the last of the boulders and began brushing herself off in an exaggerated display. "Took you long enough," she remarked with a teasing note in her voice. Small tufts of carbon-charred ceramic plating falling off her breastplate as she smacked her hand across a toasted utility pouch. "Well, we had to stop and enjoy the scenery, you know," Arthur responded with a smirk behind his mirrored visor. He was glad she was joking given the circumstances. That meant she was still combat effective even if her vital signs were still a little sporadic from the close call. "Come on, looks like an open seat in the lead, Vic. Double time it, Spartan." He didn't need to finish the rest of that sentence out loud. The reason that seat was open was because the passenger, not a few moments later, was struck by a plasma round from one of the attack craft's twin cannons. "Race you there, then!" she jibed and jogged toward the lead vehicle. Arthur did the same in kind, and the procession carried on. The rest of the ride was uneventful. Now only a few hundred meters from the city entrance, the remaining members of the convoy could make out in grim detail the hellscape they were about to enter. The landscape turned from a picturesque view of rolling meadows and plains to a cold industrial scene. One by one, Arthur could hear the warthogs accelerating from the soft and fertile soil to paved concrete roads as they entered the city. It felt more like entering a crypt than a city once filled with millions of denizens. One by one, the convoy passed into the city limits, demarked by obstacles of all kinds. Concrete barricades at one checkpoint, then a guard tower manned by 2 frightened militiamen, then a hastily dug-out trench of earth with a single man-made bridge over the center. Arthur leaned over the vehicle to see several Lotus anti-tank mines buried haphazardly on either side. Several Seraph's close attack fighters screamed overhead as the procession crossed into the city proper. Arthur noted the tense silence over the comm channels. He looked over to see the driver tighten his grip on the steering wheel. His onboard computer showed his name and file. This was his second tour and had plenty of action under his belt. Kilometers away lay the behemoth Covenant CCS-class battlecruiser looming over the waning skyline. Streaks of brilliant burn orange and soft pink hues were marred by the cacophony of explosions and belching black smoke, and fire clogging the evening skyline. The once bustling streets were dead silent. Gone now were the familiar sounds which inhabited the industrial sector of Boundary's largest city. Arthur could picture it now in his mind's eye as they passed a derelict piece of construction machinery. A crane was half-raised with its payload still dangling in solidarity against the backdrop of a half-finished building. The Spartan commander turned his gaze over to the driver's side and then back to the gunner's position. His driver, a young lance corporal, had clearly been blooded by combat. Arthur watched as the young man's eyes darted from one shadow to the next, scanning in a 180-degree view for threats. Conversely, Arthur noted that his Warthog's tri-barreled turret remained stationary and in the rested position at the bottom of its mounting bracket. The Marine behind the gun was numb and awestruck by the destruction all around them. Arthur decided to engage with the uninitiated soldier. His onboard computer instantly identified the Marine by his helmet's identifying tag and opened a direct channel. No use in shouting over the roar of the Warthog's engine. First time seeing a Covenant attack private, he decided to go with a softer tact than what the soldier's platoon sergeant would afford him. The private's face lit up with a mixture of confusion and embarrassment, his cheeks now flush and pupils constricting to locate the one asking the question. He responded with a timid voice. Yeah. He trailed off, not knowing what to say or whom to look at. He continued to man the turret, both arms akimbo toward the shoulder braces on the turret's frame, thumbs hovering over the firing studs. He cut the Marine a break and eased the tension. The raid from the Banshee flight was just a taste of what the young man would soon encounter. Better to get his head back in the fight than let it trail off with shell shock and apathy. Arthur leaned back and slapped the gunner's leg in a playful manner, making him recoil slightly, denoting it was him that sent the transmission. Arthur surmised by the Marine flinching and the ghastly expression on his face that the lax attitude was more from shell shock and less from an indifference to the events going on around him. "Take a breath and remember your training, Goldman," he said, using the Marine's name to snap him out of his stupor and regain focus on the mission. With the entire city under fire, and only a mechanized platoon of Marines at his disposal, Arthur needed every stick in the fight. Private Goldman nodded down to the armored soldier and flexed his hands on the trigger controls. He shifted his weight, less from unfamiliarity with the weapon platform and more of a renewed vigor to kill every last alien bastard that was unlucky enough to cross into his crosshairs. Several more minutes of silent driving passed, save for the steady roaring growl of the Warthog's engine. No humans or Covenant in the streets, abandoned parks and commerce centers, just black smoke and flames billowing from every other building. As the battlecruisers made landfall, they softened up the city through targeted plasma bombardment. That, coupled with Banshee strafing runs and Wraith mortar rounds, left the city in a state of ruin after only a few hours. Those buildings that were saved from the opening salvos were being raided by opportunistic jackals and curious grunt thralls. As the convoy rounded the corner, Arthur could see a pitched battle raging off in the distance. About a kilometer away and closing fast, a scene of brutal warfare was playing out right in front of the convoy. Emanating from the south were several Covenant Shadow Troop transports gliding over the broken concrete to supply fresh troops to the front lines. Blue and green plasma streaking from behind hastily erected energy shield platforms and shade-heavy weapon emplacements. Shade turrets, as they're known to the UNSC, were stationary gun turrets that offer the gunner a 360-degree field of fire and was versatile enough to serve roles as both anti-infantry and anti-air assets. Right now, they were providing deadly suppressive fire to the friendly forces dead ahead, withering fire chipping away at the metal and concrete and anything standing between the grunt gunners and their targets. Opposite the Covenant forces were a reduced company of what looked like militia fighters augmented by ODST helljumpers and a handful of Marines. Arthur's onboard computer began scanning for active frequencies coming from the troopers' locations, already attending to his subconscious thoughts. After a moment, a pop followed by a hiss, then a low stream of static began on a troop frequency. He could now hear a flurry of orders from squad leaders, platoon commanders, and even one of the ODST fire teams before a voice broke through the discord that he recognized. A confident but distracted voice rang in Arthur's helmet, instantly recognized as Solomon. 069. Heads up, 1-3, shift fire left to that ghost flanking around the troop transport. Lieutenant Green, need some rockets on that shadow maneuvering to drop that pair of hunters. The transmission continued non-stop with the sporadic burst of automatic fire rattling off so close to the mouthpiece that Arthur would have had to recoil if it weren't for his helmet's self-modulating aural receptors. They compounded his augmented hearing and allowed him to hear a pin drop in a sandstorm, as Dr. Halsey once said. Teal 2, this is Teal 1, need an assist, Arthur said. While he waited for a response, he began to outline orders for the convoy to split apart and take advantageous positions to encircle the advancing troops. Teal leader, what a sight for sore eyes, the disembodied voice cheered. We were on our way back to the governor's bunker when we were cut off by a company of coveys. A missile streaked across an open boulevard and found purchase on a ghost, attempting to maneuver around the wreckage to flank the ODST. I'm on a priority 1 mission straight from the top, Solomon continued. Governor Huxley said she needed me and the ODSTs back at camp pronto. All right, hang in there, Teal 2. I've got heavy weapons and warthogs en route. ETA 30 seconds. Tell your men to keep their heads down. A quick click from the receiver signaled the Spartans' acknowledgement. No doubt under fire, and coordinating a hasty defense in place as their party got into position. Arthur got to work even before they dismounted on foot. The column would conduct an envelopment from 3 sides, with Solomon's forces on the middle and in elevated positions. Arthur could already hear Solomon issuing orders for the designated marksmen from both elements, ODST and militia, to take positions in the nearby buildings. On the east side of the city square farthest from the platoon of mechanized Marines, a clutch of grunts was hiding behind man-sized shattered stone debris. Several Scorpion main battle tank rounds had erupted through the ground floor of a shopping center moments prior, crippling the previous waves of grunts and jackals' advances. Now the remaining troops were cowering behind whatever cover was left while their elite handlers shot their plasma rifles in one hand and encouraged their whelps with the other. To the south, several shadows were disembarking troops, a pair of hunters Solomon was referring to, several elite warriors, and a legion of grunts. Not allowing the Covenant to rout their forces, Arthur could hear both Solomon and First Lieutenant Green shouting orders to press their attack. The platoon of Marines concealed up the road to the west couldn't have come at a better time. They would press the attack and buy Arthur the time he needed to get to the bank, where General Grant was located. While observing the dispositions of the hostile light infantry and vehicles, Arthur instructed Sheila to take 5 of his remaining warthogs and flank the Covenant's troop carriers from the side, eliminating their main supply route and access to fresh troops. There, she would cordon off the boulevards to the southern approach and discourage more attack craft from entering the battle space. Arthur would take the left flank to the far east, out of sightline from the remaining troops in the area. He'd take his and one other reconnaissance vehicle swinging wide of the battle and punch straight into the contested city block from the side, in hopes of disrupting the enemy and increasing the chances of a total withdrawal. Coupled with Solomon's sniper teams and the last handful of warthogs at his disposal, the heavy lifting would be done. Sheila's group took off in a blaze down half a kilometer of avenue and rounded a corner farther into the distance. The second group organized themselves in a skirmisher line, then slowly advanced toward the throng of infantry 300 meters farther into the open promenade. Although behind the cover of ruined trees and concrete stanchions, the shield plate of each gunner's turrets began to glow a deep red, glancing plasma rounds ricocheting off the titanium plating. Arthur and the two Marine crewmen of his Warthog set out toward their position, pulling a quick U-turn, and backtracked past a massive multi-storied building. Broken glass crunched beneath the tires. Black smoke billowed from several buildings near an apartment complex farther down the street, parallel to Solomon's position. Around the next corner, Arthur would abandon the vehicle to bring his rocket launcher to bear. As he did so, a group began to emerge from around the scattered remains of the third story of an apartment building that was struck earlier by a plasma round. Superheated rounds began to streak past the humans' vehicles, and the triple-barreled M41 Vulcan chain gun tore down the street and began to chew up its targets. He jumped out and slung the rocket launcher that lay at his feet. Reaching behind his helmet, he found purchase in his gauntlet and grabbed his MA-5B assault rifle. He took a knee, fired 4 controlled bursts in concert with another Marine, the passenger of the second Warthog, and felled several more Grunt and Jackal warriors. Methane tanks erupted in eccentric bursts of blue-green methane, while Jackals, an apt name for such an avian-like creature, squawked and writhed as they were taken down by a hail of bullets and frozen methane clouds. Arthur moved forward and took a glancing blow from a needler round to the chest place. Looking down, he could see a small shard which had splintered from the projectile lodged in the bend of his left arm. The minuscule, glowing fragment wrenched itself in the nanocarbon composite outer shell, then promptly shattered into smaller shards upon detonation. He shrugged off the round and reloaded behind a burning vehicle. Wheeling around on one knee, he motioned for one driver to move into position on the curb of one side of the street while the other did the same. The Spartan slapped a fresh magazine into the receiver and racked the bolt. With the ammunition counter on his rifle displaying 60, he erupted from his position and sent a fusillade of lead toward a pair of elites. Their energy shields failed in a burst of static electricity, surprising them both as a half-ton of armored human barreled toward them. From a dead sprint, the Spartan jumped onto a destroyed concrete bench, then launched himself another 3 meters, sailing over several grunts, conducted a front flip, and landed on the ground. The grace of such a fluid human stunned the onlookers of both sides as the fighting raged on. Arthur took the pause of the elite's compromised energy shielding to close the last few meters, and flung the stock of the assault rifle into the 4-jawed mandibles of the left elite, caving in his skull and dropping it instantly. Arthur spun to the right, rose the barrel of his weapon, and was knocked to the ground by the second elite. The blow came from its plasma rifle, a cool blue weapon with the telltale ornate designs by the prophets of the Covenant. The rifle was comprised of 2 large plasma battery conduits encased in an odd ergonomic design. From the fore of the weapon, a charged glow of particles shone a light blue, waiting for the firing mechanism to cycle the next round. The Spartan took the blow in stride and rolled on his side away from the fallen elite. The MA-5B went clattering away from the duel, however, and Arthur found himself without a weapon. The elite stood over him within striking distance, so the M41 rocket launcher, still magnetically clamped to his back, was of no use. Without any other option, he readied himself in a fighting stance and extracted the combat knife from the hardened carbon weave sheath on his thigh. Luckily for Arthur, the pair of warthogs were laying effective fire against the enemy, either suppressing the remains of the aliens or tearing them apart outright. This afforded the Spartan the fraction of a second to recover, close the remaining distance with the elite warrior, and take him to the ground. The fighters now tangled in a deathlock as they writhed around on the broken ground beneath them. Arthur lay on his side opposite of the blue armor-clad elite, one arm pinned to the ground under the scaly beast. The other was still clutching the combat knife, struggling to gain the upper hand, and found its purchase in the elite's neck. He rotated his hips up from the ground at a 90-degree angle, positioning his groin so he could spring both legs downward. Arthur twisted and got his body into position perpendicular to the chest of the alien warrior and erupted with all the might his Mjolnir armor's servos could muster. He felt a sickly crunch under his boots, crushing the rib cage of the alien. It bellowed in pain and rage, releasing its grasp on the gauntleted Spartan and clutched its chest in agony. The Spartan finished the kicking motion by slamming his heels on the deck, springing off once again as graceful as an Olympic gymnast, and landing back on his feet. He scrambled to retrieve the closest weapon in reach, the elite's plasma rifle. Raising its own rifle against him, he squeezed the trigger and dispatched the enemy. He discarded the rifle and jogged over to retrieve his discarded weapon. While Arthur finished mopping up the rest of the Covenant flank, he and the crews of the two warthogs rolled up an incline in the street nearest them and engaged the enemy. Now caught in a three-way crossfire and effectively cut off from reinforcements, the combined assault of Solomon's company and Arthur's remaining troops whittled the Covenant in short order. The ones who retreated were taken care of by Sheila and her section. The fighting fell to sporadic shots here and there as he mopped up the last few grunts flailing away from the battle. The run toward Solomon's position ended at the rising granite steps of a courthouse and found him emerging cautiously from behind a Doric-style column of faded marble. There were fresh plasma burns across his thighs and forearm, but otherwise, no worse for the wear. The towering Spartan retrieved a fresh magazine for his battle rifle and slapped it into the receiver. He swiped two dirty black fingers across his faceplate and looked at his team leader. "Fancy meeting you here," Solomon said. "Get tired of staring at a boring old Covenant cruiser?" Another Marine sauntered over to the position and reloaded the magazine in his rifle. The slick black finish of the battered armor told Arthur it was one of the ODSTs, and by the nameplate, he could see it was Lieutenant Green. "Sir." Arthur stiffened slightly but didn't salute. It was never acceptable for any soldier to salute in an active combat zone. They had just cleared this sector of hostiles, but it was impossible to scan the myriad of windows and shadows and other potential hides where a sniper might lay in wait. "Nice to see you, Teal Leader," he said as his faceplate depolarized. The now clear faceplate revealed a young man with sandy blonde hair just past regulation length. He had soft green eyes and a nice smile. Premature crow's feet and laugh lines are hinted on the corners of his eyes and mouth, indicating both too much time in cryo and too much stress from this damn war, Arthur thought. "Sorry, sir, just a coincidence, actually," Arthur said. "We received an urgent hail from General Grant that his team had been ambushed en route to an evacuation convoy. We were the first to get him on comms." He proceeded to explain the rest and how they got to where they are now. "So," he began again, "we could use your help to finish securing the objective." "Wish we could, Arthur. We're only here because of new orders ourselves." "What orders, sir?" 47 minutes ago I was raised by Governor Huxley that the Death's Hand had found something near the asteroid belt on the edge of the star system. We were instructed by the governor and her staff to get in touch with you and relay the message, but they can't get any signals out of the city right now. We think the Covenant are setting up local frequency jammers to disrupt our movements." Solomon took a step away from the group and peered across the battlefield to see Sheila. The smoke had cleared just enough from the fiery wreckage of a shadow troop carrier to show the Spartan mounted on the turret of one of the warthogs. He waved and turned back to the pair. "Sorry to bail on the party, Arthur, but this wasn't one we could just sit out. What's the mission? Anything that important must be a good find." "The Death's Hand is on deep-range reconnaissance right now because the task force is tied up in their engagement topside. A few hours ago, they spotted a Covenant support ship on its own. They're afraid they'll attract unwanted attention with nukes, so they requested us. And it looks like you're the lucky winner," a familiar voice chimed in on squad comm. Sheila was listening in from afar while holding rear security for the beleaguered Marines. "Yeah, lucky me. They want us to rendezvous with them in less than 3 hours from now and meet them across the plains on the other side of the continent. On our way back from our blocking position farther down the road, we were hit by these guys." He raised an arm and made a sweeping motion across the plaza of dead bodies and smoking debris. As if on cue, the twisted wreckage of a Wraith gun carriage erupted in a dazzling plume of blue flames. The massive fins of its main cannon folded inward to the fuselage, and secondary explosions popped and fizzled out. "Well, I'll leave you to it then, gentlemen," Arthur said. "But looks like you have a few soldiers to spare. Do you mind?" he said, seeing how Solomon was the only person other than the ODSTs rated for extravehicular activity in 0G, or EVA. It was only logical that the Marines around him would need to be put to work elsewhere. "You can have the Colonial Militia and the rest of 3rd Platoon." Lieutenant Green motioned to the west side of the skirmisher line toward the direction his convoy arrived from. "But my boys are with us. It just so happens we have our EVA ratings and our suits are vacuum sealed, so Solomon doesn't have to leg it alone." "All right, sir. Then we'll see you on the other side," Arthur said. He started his way down the carved steps of the courthouse and was preparing to gather the Marines in the plaza to continue the push toward the city center, then open Team Com. "Solomon, you good with this?" he said as he continued to speak with the platoon commanders organizing their squads. "Don't worry about it, I've already got the plan," he said confidently. "Remember the debriefing from Operation Silent Storm?" Solomon was referring to a series of asymmetrical surgical strikes against Covenant supply lines early in the war. 3 teams of Spartan 2 commandos, supplemented by a wing of Prowler stealth craft and an entire battalion of ODST troopers, conducted several raids on Covenant logistic outposts and other targets of opportunity, culminating in the utter destruction of a planet-wide refueling station and shipyard. Preceding the last engagement of the operation, Solomon and his team had infiltrated a similar Covenant vessel through umbilical docking vestibules. This time, they would do a similar maneuver and leave a little surprise in its bowels to leave a fresh reminder not to underestimate humanity. "It's a sound plan," Arthur said. "Tried and true. Just be careful out there, yeah?" he said with more finality than he would have liked. "We've got this," Teal 2 said with bravado. "Come on, Lieutenant. We've got to double time if we're going to get back to the governor's building in time." With less than 3 hours to find safe aerial transport and fly across the supercontinent to rendezvous with the Death's Hand, Solomon and the rest of Teal Force were hard-pressed for time. "Good luck, gents," Arthur murmured as he watched the Marines return to their warthogs and mongooses en route to the north and back to the governor's compound.